Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Mike Fielding. I'm a partner in the Food and Agribusiness Unit here in the Kansas City office of Husch Blackwell, and I'm happy to do our presentation for you today. I hope it's educational and beneficial. I have a few housekeeping matters that I need to cover, and then we'll dive into the meat of the presentation. To begin, I want to direct your attention to the bottom of your audience console. There are multiple application items down there for your use today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit them in the question box. I will try to answer all questions during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed, or if we run out of time, I will follow up with you individually to respond. A PDF presentation is available in the resources folder. This program has been approved for continuing legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including the course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Toward the end of the program, be sure to complete the survey. We use this survey to really get feedback to try to do frankly, better programs in the future that are really aligned with the interests and needs that you have. So any feedback you can give is greatly appreciated. That is really all we have for housekeeping matters. So let's dive into the meat of the presentation. And I want to start here today with an experience that I had late last summer and early fall. And at the time, I was really interested in the question of how do you effectively resolve distressed agricultural loans. I was really focusing on ag loans at the time. And so what I did is I ended up contacting about 30 different people. This is loan officers, special asset officers, in-house counsel at banks, and this is both big banks, small banks. And I posed essentially the same question, which is, what are the best practices for dealing with these distressed loans? And I got some really good feedback from everybody. Everybody had a lot of insight. Everybody's experience was a little bit unique. But in talking with everybody, there were two themes that seemed to really emerge. Theme number one is that almost everybody essentially said, listen, at the end of the day, every situation is unique. And theme number two was that there wasn't a global comprehensive framework to help guide the decision-making process when it came to these distressed agricultural loans. Now, with those two ideas in mind, and around this same time, I came across a study from the McKinsey Group. And if we go here to the second slide, this McKinsey Group study was looking at over 1,000 major corporate decisions. And they were asking the question, does data analytics have a bigger impact, or does the quality of the decision-making process have a better outcome? And as you can see in the middle of the screen, the answer is pretty astounding. The quality, the process, the decision-making process mattered by a factor of 6. So it's a big difference, and it's a surprising difference. Now, by saying all this, I'm not discounting data analytics. It's extremely important. But what is critical here and what is often overlooked is that when we're sorting through all this data, looking at it, making our decisions, we need to think about the process that we're applying and focusing to the data so that we can make optimal outcomes to get, frankly, better results. So with that study in mind, what I then did, and after having spoken to a lot of folks in the banking industry, is I did my own deep dive into a lot of academic literature, dealing with a lot of the issues that we're going to talk about here today. And I also drew on my, almost 20 years dealing with insolvency-related issues. And through this process, I came up with a framework to really apply to distressed debt generally. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. It's a framework, it's a process to help you try to make better decisions in resolving distressed debt. So let's talk about the agenda. What we're going to do here today is we're going to cover 4 big items. The first item is we're going to talk about the framework on a high level, and I call this the distressed debt Hinge framework. I'm going to explain just a high-level overview. Then we're going to take an important detour into the key players, key traits and incentives, and the decision-making errors that go into play when we're dealing with distressed debt, because those two items have a big influence on this Hinge framework that I'll show you in a moment. And then we're going to circle back around. Once we've covered that groundwork, we're going to circle back around to the hinges and go through them in a little bit more detail, again, to try to help empower you and help you make better decisions. So let's start with part number one. I'm going to use, because it's had its genesis in ag, we're going to use an ag theme for today's presentation. Now, I want to make the caveat up front that just because I'm using an ag theme doesn't mean it does not apply in the commercial loan context. This definitely applies in a commercial loan setting as well. So let's talk about a hinge on a gate. We've seen these, the big green farm gates. We've all seen them. They're kind of fun if you have a gate on a good post. It doesn't take much effort. You can push it, and that big gate's going to swing a big distance. And when you think about it, what's happening is you have that teeny little hinge. And at that teeny little hinge, there's a teeny bit of movement. But on the opposite end, at the end of the gate, that gate is swinging a really big difference. So it's that teeny bit of movement at the hinge that has a huge, or maybe you could say oversized outcome at the end of the gate. So let's take that principle, and this life lesson right here, but this to help you understand this concept a little bit better. We all go through hinge points in our own life. A hinge point is where you're at like a key critical juncture, and the decision that you make has an oversized or bigger outcome on the results. So let's give a couple of personal examples. Many of you, all of us, most of us have been faced with the decision of how big of a house we buy. And we all can see people, some people, maybe they purchased a more modest house, saved for retirement, or you'll know other people that they wanted everything. They bought a really big house, they maxed out their income. The net result is they weren't able to save as much for retirement. Well, that was a small decision, or a decision made in a short amount of time, maybe made 10, 15, 20 years ago. But when you start looking at the results of that decision over time, there's a huge difference as to where people end up being economically. You could apply this in all other areas. Maybe the spouse you married, the career you chose, the job you chose, or maybe turned down. You get the point. So a hinge point in the distressed debt context is it's an event that's going to occur over a short period of time, again, that has a major impact on the recovery of the loan. That's a key definition that we're looking at. The challenge is identifying when hinge points occur, because when you're dealing with a troubled loan, honestly, you've got a lot coming at you. And sometimes it's hard to tell what's the forest for the trees. What's a hinge point, what's really critical, versus what is really more noise, but doesn't have a lot of importance at the end of the day. The other key thing about hinge points is that they're not fixed in time. We can sometimes see them on the horizon, but they can be pushed off or they can be accelerated depending on the situation. If we know what the hinge points are, though, we know what to look for. Now, why focus on hinge points? And you're saying, what are the hinge points? I know I sound like a car salesman. We're going to get that in the next two slides. The key thing here with this hinge point framework is we want something that's easy to remember. It keeps the big picture in mind, and it can be broadly applied. And you'll see in the next two slides what I mean by that when we get to it. The hinge point analysis is really like the 80-20 rule. We're going to really focus on those items, those areas that have the biggest difference on the outcome, because that's where we need to focus our efforts. One key thing, and I think an example on a personal level that we can all relate to, is saving for retirement. Maybe you, at the beginning of your career, made the decision that you were going to just do automatic deductions into your 401k, and you've been on autopilot ever since. Well, we know that that's a hinge point. It was a decision made at the early part. It was good. You can see the effect later on. the thing is, what if you didn't make that decision? What if you were tight for cash, or maybe you had that big house and so you postponed that decision, and maybe you didn't start saving for retirement until 5 years later? Well, you know the results. You missed that window of opportunity. Time went on, and then maybe you started saving 5 years later. But what's the net result? Well, it's obvious. Somebody who started saving 5 years earlier has a bigger 401k versus the person who started 5 years later. It's the same concept with the hinge point. If we take advantage of the hinge point, we put ourselves as a lender in a better position to deal with the distressed loan. If we miss our hinge point, then we are in a comparatively weaker position as time goes on. Now, one final point, then we're going to get to the specific hinges. What I'm going to articulate here, this is not some instant cure formula for all your hard problems, all right? And if I'm coming across sounding like that, that's not the message I intend to convey. This is not going to resolve your hard problems with distressed debt. What I am trying to give to you is a methodology or a framework to help you make better decisions so that you can hopefully get better outcomes. That's what I'm trying to do here today. So let's talk about what these hinges are. So there's 7 that I've identified. The first 3 have nothing to do with attorneys. The last 4 are where you get attorneys involved. The first hinge is underwriting. The second one is documenting the loan. That's actually getting it signed, getting your UCCs filed, perfecting the loan. The third one, the early exit, which is actually the most important hinge, is where you try to get out of the loan when it's going south. You then get into forbearance, pursuing your default remedies, debtor in possession financing, and bankruptcy plan confirmation. And again, we're going to talk about all of these in detail here later on in our presentation. Now, there's this chart that I've created to visually depict what we're going on here. And you can see with the red dots, each red dot is a hinge. And the downward red line is intended to show a deteriorating loan. And you'll notice that there's that refinance zone that goes across the middle. And that's actually a good break, right? Because when you're above the refinance zone, you don't have insolvency attorneys involved. You're dealing with this in-house. But when you cross that refinance zone, that's when you're getting into the forbearance area, distressed debt. That's when you start contacting your insolvency attorneys. The refinance zone is that period of time when the loan is still marketable enough that the borrower can go out in the marketplace and find somebody to refinance the loan and frankly take that problem credit off of your hands. Now you'll see those 3 dots going up, especially at hinge 4, 6, and 7. The idea behind these hinges is that especially at those points, excuse me, if we make the right decisions, we can try to change that downward trajectory to an upward trajectory. And so you can visually see that maybe we have the forbearance period and maybe we missed our opportunity and the loan continues to deteriorate, but then you get into hinge number 6, well, you're in a comparatively weaker situation, but you still have the opportunity to try to turn things around. Okay, now we have to give some important caveats. The first caveat, really the big caveat here, is that we don't want to confuse excuse me, leverage points with hinge points. When I use the term leverage, I'm not talking about leverage in the sense of debt. I'm talking about leverage in the sense of your ability to influence, to persuade the borrower to make certain decisions. The personal guarantee is the best example of a leverage point, right? You as the lender control the leverage. You control when you're going to make a call on that personal guarantee, make a demand for payment. A hinge point, in contrast, is something that you influence, but you don't control when it occurs. And so we want to keep that distinction in mind, because the idea is that when we get to a hinge point, we want to use all the leverage that we as a lender have so that we can try to put ourselves in an optimal position to be able to deal with this troubled loan. All right, so let's move on. Second part, the key players, the key traits. Now this is where we want to keep these ideas in mind when we're looking at the different players, the different parties, because these incentives impact how things play out when we get to a hinge. So let's start by looking in the mirror. All right, lenders. We all know ourselves. We know ourselves pretty well. Reputational risk is a restraint, especially for normal institutionalized lenders. Traditional lenders tend to address troubled loans in traditional manners. Again, no surprise, we get this. It's important, though, to note that from a lender's perspective, there is relatively little upside to a distressed loan. I mean, at most, you're going to recover your interest and hopefully your attorney's fees. You want to get both if you can. But you have a huge downside because in a worst case scenario, you'll end up losing principal. And obviously that's not good. One of the findings from the academic literature, again, not terribly surprising, is that lenders are very biased towards liquidation, right? And so when you get a bad loan, what do you want? Well, refinance it, take me out, go somewhere else, pay me off, or if that's not an option, liquidate the collateral, pay me off, pay me down as quickly as possible. That's really where lenders want to be. They don't have any incentive to try to roll the dice or play things on. Now, the interesting thing about this, everything I've been saying here is for traditional lenders. If you change the tables to a private lender, maybe particularly a hedge fund of some sort that's maybe in a loan-to-own strategy, some of these incentives will change, and that impacts the behavior. And that becomes really important when you have a multi-party framework with the debtor in the middle and maybe multiple secured lenders, and everybody's kind of jockeying around trying to get the best position. Now let's talk about borrowers. Borrowers, for the most part, especially small businesses, will rarely have a change in management. And that is both good and bad. It's bad in the sense that the bad business practices that got you to where you're at are really ingrained and are going to be really hard to change. It can be good in the sense that you have continuity, continual relationships, you know what's going on, and you can kind of predict how the person is going to operate. Borrowers are not static, right? As the behavior will change as the situation changes. So one day they may be your friend, 2 weeks later they may be your adversary, and it's because of that change in circumstances. And so we always have to keep that in mind, that as the circumstances change, the incentives change, which means the behavior is going to change as well. Another key item coming out of the academic literature is that the perceived equity is really important. And it's common sense, because if you have a borrower who feels like they've got a huge equity cushion, they're going to be really motivated to try to preserve that equity cushion. And so then if we take that concept and apply it, I think in ag loans is the one where we can especially see this. Let's say you have a family land, it's been in the family for 4 or 5 generations, and maybe this farmer just over the years has slowly mortgaged the property and just kind of eaten into that equity just to try to finance really what are farming losses. And then they get to the point where there's marginal equity at best in this farm ground. Well, even though from a dollars and cents perspective, it doesn't make sense to hold on to it, you have that emotional equity, that emotional tie to the business. And so there's going to still be a strong motivation to try to keep that collateral. That's an important incentive to keep in mind. You also see that concept when you're talking about a small business owner. Maybe you have somebody, you have a guy, he missed his kids' birthdays. He was working 12, 13, 14 hours a day for 2 decades to try to save the business. He's invested his life in it. And for a person to try to walk away is going to be really, really hard. They've got that emotional equity. Well, that impacts the incentives, all right? Need to keep that in mind. I need to move on. I'm rambling here a bit. On the borrowers, borrowers will pay the creditors that they need. This was an interesting study that came out of the New York Federal Reserve. They were looking at consumers in the subprime loan housing context, and what they found is that as the consumers went underwater, they obviously defaulted on their loans to their mortgage lender, but they were pretty current on their credit card debt. And that's a surprising result. But it makes a lot of sense because they realized that their mortgage lender was a lost cause. The house was gone, but they needed the credit card company so that they could have cash going forward. Well, you take that concept and put it into a business. And a lot of times, let's say you are the primary lender to a company and you've got this blanket lien, but maybe again, that equity cushion's gone and the person has emotionally or mentally just written you off. Then what's really frustrating is they start paying the landlord, trade creditors, maybe some PMSI lenders, and you're sitting here as a lender saying, hey, I've got a blanket lien on everything. I should be getting paid first. Well, the problem is the borrower is paying who they think they'll need in the future. And if they've written you off, they really don't care about paying you. So we want to keep that dynamic in mind as we're dealing with them. Now, here's another really interesting academic article I came across. There were these, the researchers identified 3 key factors that influence bankruptcy. And you can see it there on the screen. The debt level, short-term cash, and the ability to coordinate with creditors. And this is like a formula. It's a really good perspective or way to think about your borrower. What's the likelihood of the borrower filing for bankruptcy? Well, look at those 3 questions or those 3 items and ask yourself, where are they at? What's the debt level? What's the short-term cash? What's the ability to coordinate with creditors? And guess what? Especially if you're a lender with a large, influence on the borrower. Maybe you've got their accounts, you've got a blanket lien in the property. You really have the ability to either accelerate or postpone a bankruptcy filing, depending on what you do with those 3 factors. Now, you don't completely control it, but you will definitely have maybe an oversized influence on how that plays out. Now, there's third-party creditors. They help in the short term, they hurt in the long term, right? They help because you get the new cash, the new assets, the new services, but it doesn't come free. They've got to service the debt. You have the increased debt load. The third-party creditors are going to engage in their own tactics to try to get themselves paid. They'll try to leverage their position to extract concessions, and I call it kind of legal and economic judo, where sometimes maybe you're the big behemoth lender in this picture and you've got a PMSI lender here, but because of the unique interplay or the situation, they may try to use the weight of the situation to get some benefit for themselves. The legal system. I will tell you as an attorney, having been in various cases, it can be very frustrating to be in the legal proceeding. We want results. We want results in our way. And a lot of times the law is not fast. It's very slow. It can be easily delayed. Smart attorneys on the other side can really slow down the process, and it can be really aggravating. But that's the situation we're dealing with. It's important to keep in mind that the bankruptcy code is structurally biased to favor debtors. It wasn't written with the benefit of helping creditors or banks. It's written with the benefit of helping debtors. And so when we get kind of disappointing results, we know why. One study that was really interesting is that if you have companies that go bankrupt and the judge is really a pro-debtor judge who tends to rule in favor of debtors, those companies will tend to have a higher failure rate following bankruptcy. Now, attorneys, I've got to look in the mirror, obviously. We tend to be overconfident. We tend to underestimate our fees. You can see there that the amount of attorney's fees, I list 2 items, the complexity of the situation, how adversarial it is, and I would add a third one that should have been up there, and that is the duration of the proceedings. The longer it goes on, the more the attorney's fees will be. That being said, if you have a really good attorney, that can really make a difference in the outcome of the case. I've definitely seen that over the years. All right, let's get on to part 3, the decision-making errors. I need to give a little preface here, and you see the word bias, and I think especially in 2021, you hear the word bias and you start thinking, oh, like gender bias or race bias. And that's not at all what I'm talking about. The word bias really comes out of a lot of academic literature when they're talking about it in the context of decision-making errors. You're biased or predisposed to one way of thinking or another way of thinking, And so that's why we get the term. The question is, well, why on earth do we want to think about this? Well, we are all human, and we are all subject to our own biases or decision-making errors, our own preconceived views of the world and how things should operate. We all have our own experiences. And what happens is when we're encountering a new situation, we're really drawing upon all these different experiences that we've had and however it's jumbled up here in each of us, and we're making our decisions. Now, that's where the kind of the rubber hits the road, right? You're getting the data, you're pulling it in, and this goes back to that McKinsey study, and then you're really up here in your mind, sorting it all out and trying to make an optimal decision for the situation. The borrower's going through that same process. The third-party creditors are going through that same process. And you can see that if we can really go through a good, organized manner to really make a good decision, then our results should be better. So let's talk about some of these biases or decision-making errors that come up. The first one is the anchoring bias. And this is where you are anchored to your initial situation, right? You view the situation and you act on the situation based on your initial valuation. And it's really hard for us as human beings to move away from that initial valuation. Let me give you an example, a story just to illustrate this. So last year, during COVID, my wife and I really started asking ourselves, hey, should we move more out to the country? And part of that process of if we move out to the country, get a little bit away from the city, work remotely, was how much can we sell our house for? Well, the interesting thing about that calculus is we purchased our home in 2012, and I had it in my mind what the home's value was, and I knew it had appreciated a little bit, but I didn't think it had really gone up that much. My wife, on the other hand, who's a realtor, who's constantly looking at real estate values all the time, really had a much better assessment of the situation. And so when we're talking about, well, can we afford this house or that house, I'm really looking at it of, all right, how much can we sell our existing house for, and what would be the ultimate, net price at the end of the day? And we had two different valuations, okay? I was anchored to the past. My wife had the ability, based on the current data, to really be more anchored to the present. All right, so that illustrates the concept. As a side note, we didn't move, sticking in our house right now, but it's it's an interesting process as you go through that and thinking about moving. Now, why is this all important? Well, when we're looking at distressed debt, the collateral is really important. We're going to do our initial assessment of the collateral. How easy is it going to be to liquidate? What's the market like? And that is really going to influence our strategy and the decisions that we make. The flip side is that's going to influence the strategy of the borrower as well. And so one thing that I would like to do if I'm in a distressed debt situation is I want to have a discussion at the beginning with the borrower and ask the question, what do you think this property's really worth? And on a certain level, it doesn't matter whether or not the borrower's right or wrong. What really matters is the answer that they give me. Because if they think the value is really high, maybe they've got an artificially high anchor, so they think there's a lot of equity in the property, that is going to open the door and let you know that they're going to be really incentivized to try to keep that property, even though realistically it may not be worth it. So they're going to probably put up a really big fight. Okay. The flip side is if they think the value of the property is really low, maybe they've artificially undervalued it, similar to like I was looking at my own home when we were thinking about that, then they may not be as incentivized to work with you. They may just view it as a loss, and they may be looking at how do they provide a different path forward so they can continue to survive. So again, we want to think through this anchoring bias to see how it plays out. Now, another bias is the representativeness bias. I love this graph of a field because it just articulates how you want to look at data. And we see the representativeness bias really in two forms. Sometimes we focus on too much on old data, or we get data in and we're focusing on it, but it's really outlier data. And so we know that if we're looking at old, outdated data or outlier data, well, that's going to distort the process. And what I love about this graph, this picture here, is that in a perfect world, we want to pull in data from all sources, third-party reports, on-site visits, numbers that are reported by the borrower, benchmark data. We want to pull that all in, just like you can see those different layers on the graph. And then you want to kind of step back and say, what's the big picture? What does this mean? And I will tell you that in my experience, the loan officers that I've worked with that seem to be really good, they are the officers that, or I say loan officers are special assets folks. They're the people that are really thinking through the situation. They're looking at the data, contrasting it, thinking through the situation. They tend to get a good big picture. And once you have a good big picture perspective, again, you can make better decisions. Obviously, we want to get as much data as we can. Now, here's the next one, egocentric bias. All right, I call this the center of the universe syndrome. I deal with it, you deal with it. We all have this problem. And essentially, we think that we are unique and that the desired outcome that we want will be as we want it. We have this individually. We tend to have this institutionally within the companies that we're in. But the problem is, we're like the picture of these pivots in the field, right? We're all at the center of our own little field and we think the world's revolving around us. But if we step back and look at the big picture, we see that the world is really different. And that has a big outcome on the results. So what are problems with the egocentric bias? Well, this is just stuff I've seen over the years. The lender assumes that the borrower is going to follow the letter of the law, follow the loan documents. They're going to comply with the lender's wishes. And then guess what? The borrower doesn't. There's a breach of contract or they pay somebody else. And it's really maddening. Why is this person not complying with the law like they should, right? Well, when we step back, what's happening there is the lender is having this egocentric bias, and I think it's justified. You know, I loaned you the money. I expect you to comply with your obligation and pay me back. I mean, I think it's a proper perspective. But the problem is the borrower is viewing it differently. Yeah, I breached. Yeah, I don't have enough money, but I'm sorry. This is life. I got to go on. Well, it leads to a lot of frustration. And so if we can recognize that bias, recognize that we're not going to get everything complied with as we want, we can then create a better strategy for dealing with this borrower who's going to start acting in a manner that's maybe a little bit antagonistic towards us as the lender. The next one, overconfidence bias. This is when you overestimate your ability to predict the outcome of a future decision. You see this with loan officers or special assets when they're trying to estimate the liquidation value of the collateral. Sometimes they really get it right. I think especially more seasoned ones. Younger loan officers or people that haven't dealt with troubled assets as much maybe tend to overestimate what they would get. What I'm saying is that the net liquidation results tends to be smaller. And it's a problem that afflicts all of us. Now, one thing, a simple question that I think would help you and me as we're dealing with the overconfidence bias is to ask yourself, what if I'm wrong? What if my prediction is wrong? Then what? What do I do at that point? Because the reality of the matter is none of us bats 1,000. We all make mistakes to a degree. And we want to think through the scenario of, okay, here's my option A, my plan A, but what if I'm wrong? Then what? Going through that analysis, going through that decision-making process helps you identify better, more optimal courses of action to take to try to deal with the situation. Now, there's some other biases, and I like the picture here. You got these different silos. It's like you have a bias in each one. So let's talk about these briefly. The sunk cost bias, right? Economics 101. It's this idea that we're spending money to save something that isn't worth saving. And the real question is, does the marginal benefit equal the marginal, or does the marginal benefit justify the marginal gain or versus the marginal gain? You have misaligned individual incentives. Are your loan officers incentivized to be making loans that are really marginal at best, a little bit problematic because maybe they get some additional compensation? Obviously, that's not going to be good. You want to have compensation incentives or other incentives within the institution that are aligned to try to maximize the outcome of the decision. Confirmation bias. I think we all suffer from this to a degree. We want a result. Maybe you are a loan officer and you've got a long-standing relationship with your borrower, 10 years, and you really don't want to see this guy have the loan defaulted. And so the loan officer may go out to the business or to the farm, and they start looking around for data that supports their viewpoint, data points that confirm that it'll turn around, but simultaneously they tend to ignore contradicting data that says, sorry, this is a ship that's about to sink. So we have to be careful of that. Groupthink is another danger. Groupthink, or you could call it sunflower management. I've seen this over the years where you have a very dominant leader, typically somebody in a position of authority, typically somebody who's very smart, often very charismatic. And what happens is the group just tends to become yes people and just circle around what the leader is saying. There's a danger in that, right? Because you want to have contrarian views. You want to be able to have an honest, open dialogue to try to figure out what's the best outcome. Framing bias is another bias that we all can fall into. The classic example, do you frame it as a loss or a gain? There's the classic examples, people, they did this in a study, people would prefer to get $100 over a 50% chance of getting $200. But if you frame it the other way, they would prefer a 50% chance of losing $200 over a 100% chance of losing $100. Well, the net economic outcome in both situations is the same. But if you frame it as a gain, a sure thing, or avoiding a potential loss, you see that people migrate based on how you frame it. This has real world implications for litigation. This has been shown that plaintiffs tend to prefer settlement. They tend to prefer the sure thing, the gain, as opposed to rolling the dice. That's why banks are predisposed to liquidating. I'd prefer to liquidate the collateral, maybe take a small loss, but I know what it is and I've locked it in and I'm moving forward. Defendants, borrowers, on the other hand, have the opposite. They're framing it as a loss. They tend to be more likely to roll the dice, to litigate, realizing that, yeah, there's maybe a 9 in 10 chance that I'm going to lose, but guess what? I've got that 1 in 10 chance and maybe I'll win. So that's where you get kind of this framing really impacts the decision. The last one is the hindsight bias. This is where we overestimate how good we were at predicting outcomes. All right, I've been rambling a little bit too long. I've got to pick up the pace here because we get into section 4. We're going to go through these parts pretty quickly, but I think with this background, this will be really helpful. So we're back to the graph that I introduced earlier. We're going to walk through each one of these hinges. The first one is underwriting. And here I am, an attorney talking to bankers for the most part about underwriting. I realize I'm a hypocrite, right? You should be talking to me. I get it, all right? I'm just saying, but you're getting this from the perspective of an insolvency attorney, somebody who sees where the errors are made and then I'm dealing with it at the end. And the big issue on the underwriting is, how well are you looking at the full situation? Are you really asking yourself, when we get this loan, is the company, what's the debt structure going to be? What's the relationship with the other creditors? I think for most part, banks do a decent job at doing this. But there's one key question that could be asked, and it's this pre-mortem at the bottom. And the pre-mortem is, you ask yourself, if this loan were to deteriorate, what do you see in the future that would cause it to deteriorate? Now, this concept, I've heard it it was a book on decision making. And the authors were making the argument or the point that when we're faced with maybe decision A or decision B, a good way to try to analyze it is to say, okay, let's say we went with decision A, and then let's assume that it went bad. What do we see now that would be the result that causes decision A to be a bad move? And then you apply that same analysis to decision B. And it may turn out that you identify all these reasons why decision A could be a complete crash, but it still may be the right decision. But because you've gone through that process, because you've thought through it, you are better able to look out for those things, those events that might make decision A end up crashing, so that when you encounter those items, you realize this is really important. I have to address it so that this negative influence is minimized so that decision A ends up being a correct decision. Okay, I know I'm belaboring that point right there, but that is a really important principle. Think through your decisions. Think through your decisions and ask yourself, what could make this go wrong? And it still might be the right answer, but try that by knowing what could make it go wrong, you can try to minimize and adjust for that. All right, stepping back at Hinge 1. Another big thing you want to ask for, this is especially when you're underwriting and you're looking to refinance somebody else, you want to say, why is, maybe this borrower's been at this well-established bank in the city for quite a while, and now suddenly the other bank wants to get out, and they're trying to gently tell the borrower, go refinance with someone else. The question is, are you refinancing into someone else's problem? Is there something that other bank is seeing that really should be a red flag for you? It's a good question. And, as I'm thinking about this, I really think of, baseball. Why do teams trade baseball players? Well, obviously sometimes they want to get a prospect. That makes sense. But what happens if they have a veteran that's on the team and they're trying to unload the veteran? What is it about the veteran that the team views as a potential liability? It's an interesting concept to think through. And I suggest you could apply that same idea or thinking with the underwriting. Now, Hinge 2, documenting the loan. This is the shortest hinge. And I will again tell you, somebody working with distressed loans, it's sad to say that these errors occur more frequently than we are happy to admit. They definitely happen. And these are, documenting issues where you miss title issue or, legal descriptions or, something with the UCC filing, things of that nature. And this is really critical because if you mess up here in documenting the loan, once you discover the error down the road, down the chain, you're suddenly in protective mode. And the problem is you're losing time at a moment when that loan is really deteriorating. And we want to be in as strong a position as possible. And that's why this second hinge is so critical, because it's absolutely essential that you get it right the first time. I think a really good analogy here comes from John Deere. My brother works for John Deere up north of Quad Cities area, Davenport area is north of there. They've got a plant, and he works in their quality control. And he was telling me a few years ago, he said, in a 1 year period of time, I think Deere had a goal of like just 2 errors on the equipment that they were manufacturing. And an error could be like even a sticker coming off, all right? Something very, very minor. But, John Deere's got an incredibly good reputation for really good equipment. They have very high quality standards, and you see that in the manufacturing. Well, I submit that that's the same mindset we want to have when it comes to documenting the loan. We want as low of an error rate as we can possibly get. Now, again, I'm no expert on how to do that internally. That's really something that happens at the banking institutions. I can just tell you from a insolvency attorney, that is a hinge point, something that you really need to pay attention to. All right, hinge 3, I mentioned this earlier, the early exit. This is the most important hinge. And why is it the most important hinge? Because this is your best opportunity to exit the troubled credit, get paid in full, and minimize or have 0 attorney's fees in the process. All right, so you want to get out of town while the getting is good. Essentially what we're doing. How do you know when to do an early exit? Again, I realize this sounds like the hypocritical attorney talking to bankers here on this one, but I can tell you this is really critical. And so here's some observations. First off, you get into the numbers. Bankers are really, really good at analyzing the data. We love spreadsheets. We love looking at it. We have all different ratios, and it gives us good guidance. The problem with ratios and data is that that is really lag data. That is something that has happened in the past. There was an interesting study came out of Sweden of all places, and you can, well, it's European, we'll discount it, right? Well, the study essentially said bankers are really good with hard data, but not so good with the soft people skills. All right, so how do we improve there? Well, we need to take the soft data into account. And I think some people are naturally better at this than others. As I put here, the soft data is a leading indicator for hard data. And what I mean by that is the soft data really becomes a lead indicator, right? Hard data is a lag indicator, something that happened in the past, and it is really important. I'm not trying to discount that. But looking at the soft data, where are we headed? What are the signs that we're seeing that lets us know how is this loan going to do? And the problem is soft data is coming all over the place. And the question is, how do you properly analyze it? Well, I borrowed this concept from the Department of Homeland Security, right? So you say, well, it's government, so there must be an error involved. Well, I like this idea. And we know from Homeland Security that you have this 5-tier level. This is on the terror level threat, right? Green is the safest, red is a really bad situation. And I like the idea of doing the hard data in one column and the soft data in another column. And then essentially, like you would, like a regression analysis, just draw an arrow. Where are you headed? And so if you have hard data, a key point that's really big, that's a bigger circle. Maybe soft data, small circle would be a minor point, big circle is a big point, and then you draw the arrow and it gives you the trend to let you know where you're headed. So what would be examples of soft data? Well, what do you learn from your on-site visit? Is the place well organized? Is it well run? That's one item. Does the person have a written business plan? Does the person really know what the cost of operation is? Does the person, I say person, does the business really know when you break out individual business units, what they have to do in each business unit to be profitable? Those are examples. Another soft data point is if the management is starting to get a substance abuse problem, that's going to be a red flag. Maybe you've got a really small company and the manager is going through a divorce. That's going to be a red flag because of all the personal issues that the divorce will entail and the uncertainty that may impact it. You get the point. Let's move on in the interest of time. Hinge 4, this is where we start getting the attorneys involved. This is where we get into the forbearance period and best practices for forbearance agreements. That is an entire discussion for another day. But let's talk about the key high-level points when you're getting into this forbearance period. And again, if we look at the graph, we want to pivot. This is really critical. We want to use that hinge to swing that loan so that we're on an upward trajectory. So with the forbearance, the first thing you want to do is you really need to ask yourself the hard question: is the workout even feasible? And a lot of times you've seen this loan going downhill, the loan officer's trying to work with the borrower, but something's not clicking. It could be the economy, it could be bad business practices, it could be a lot of different factors. And that's going to be the big question. What is the root cause for the business going downhill? And can it be fixed if we do kind of a splash of cold water in their face, like a notice of default, and then couple that with the forbearance agreement? One thing that is really critical is your timing. You are much better off pulling the trigger early, getting them into a forbearance period when the business is comparatively stronger than when it is really weak. Because if you wait too long, it's like, a person that's involved in a car accident, and you leave them out on the road for 3 hours and they're bleeding, and then you take them to the ER, Well, there's not nearly as much life left in them. It's hard to resuscitate them. And what we're trying to do is get that resuscitation process going as early as possible. But sometimes people are oblivious to reality. Sometimes they're living in a bit of denial. They don't want to admit that the company's going downhill. They don't want to admit that they've got the financial problems. And sometimes it's that, again, splash of cold water in the face, wake up, whoa, I've really got some problems. I really need to do something about it. But at the same time, the lender is kind of taking almost I don't want to use the word parental approach, but in a way it is, which is, listen, you've got some problems, but I'm also here to try to work with you to get out of this situation, but you have to comply with me. So that's what we want to do. Cash flow is really critical. Other debts are really critical as we're evaluating the forbearance. Remember those three formulas I identified earlier, the three factors as to whether or not a bankruptcy would be imminent. We want to take those into account because that's going to determine how we play with the forbearance. Now, you can see here on the screen some keys to a successful forbearance agreement, well-defined milestones, ratios, prohibit additional debt, high distress costs in the case of a default. All right. Again, this is a discussion for another day. We'll get into the full details of it. At the same time that you're going through the forbearance agreement, there is always a risk that things are going to go south, that things will not work out. And so you need to be preparing for legal proceedings. And the problem is, it just seems like judges are naturally skeptical of lenders. It's, lenders and insurance companies. It's everybody's target who they don't want to love. And so because of that, because it feels a little bit unfair, you have to be prepared with your best game, so to speak, if you're going into court. So having a hunch or suspicion of wrongdoing is not enough. If there's been a default, you want to document it. You want to have some paper, tangible evidence that you can put in a pleading, put in front of a judge and say, we tried working with them. They defaulted. We still tried working with them. They still defaulted. Judge, we've got to go forward and liquidate this collateral. You're trying to set yourself up for success, and that requires the proper documented trail to get there. All right, Hinge 5. This gets us into the legal proceedings. Now, this is the interesting thing about this is at Hinge 5, trust is gone. You've tried your best. You're doing your best. Maybe you've done a forbearance agreement. The loan's still going south. Sometimes when people get sued, that's the real wake-up call to really change things. Sometimes they're still oblivious to it. Again, that's uniquely dependent on the situation. But when you're contemplating the litigation, you can see I've listed these 6 factors here. You want to think through how you're going to attack the situation. How quickly do you go in? How hard do you go in? How do you lay your record? Because as you think through those steps, it will guide you and help you to understand what's going to be the cost, what's going to be the timing, what's going to be the likely result. Going through that calculus, that analysis will guide you to know how to hit, when to hit, in what manner to hit. We need to pick up the pace again. Let's talk about bankruptcy financing, debtor in possession financing. In a perfect world, nobody would file for bankruptcy, right? But Huey Lewis in the news from, what is it, the 90s, ain't no living in a perfect world. Anyway, retro song there. It happens. And unfortunately, we have to deal with it. And the big question for debtor in possession financing is, can the borrower cash flow? If they can, then they may be a decent candidate for debtor in possession financing. And if they can cash flow, it gets to the next question: is bankruptcy a good thing? If you think about it, if you are a secured lender, especially if you have a lot of equity in the property, a bankruptcy may not be a bad thing. In fact, it may actually be a really good thing for you, because if the borrower has a lot of unsecured debt, going into bankruptcy, shedding the unsecured debt, emerging as a leaner, a better run company might actually increase the odds of overall loan success down the road. Now, obviously there's a cost to it, and that cost is the debtor in possession financing. I'll say parenthetically, especially under the Small Business Reorganization Act that went into effect in February of last year. And right now there's that $7.5 million debt limit, and it was supposed to have expired on March 27th, but President Biden signed a bill extending that another year. We still have, at least for this next year, this increased risk of these, slightly larger small businesses filing for bankruptcy. And I'll tell you, I did a presentation on this months ago. That Small Business Reorganization Act can really be used against lenders. So you have to be careful with it. Now, all that being said, if you are on really good terms with your borrower, and if they can cash flow, bankruptcy actually may be a really good thing. And the reason for that is you'll see at the bottom of the screen, there's academic research that says when they have debtor in possession financing, they are more likely to have a successful bankruptcy. And if the DIP lender is their pre-petition lender, the length of the bankruptcy is actually going to be shorter, at least on the data set that they were looking at. So there are some benefits there. Now, some elements of a successful DIP loan, I have it up there. You want to negotiate before bankruptcy. You want to have automatic default remedies, key milestones, budgets. This is a discussion for another day, but it's a really critical hinge point. Hinge number 7, plan confirmation. This is going to become the new controlling standard. And if you are the lender, you don't want to wait. You want to go out there, you want to negotiate, you want to get going ASAP to try to negotiate a treatment for you and your claim that you can live with. Sometimes that requires a little bit of compromise. It's a whole lot better than getting an adverse plan crammed down your throat. Now, when you're out there doing that, you also need to think through the big picture. You don't want to just myopically look at your loan, but you want to say, how does my loan fit the big picture? Because in a perfect world, you want to try to structure that, help, if you could, even help draft or weigh in on the plan so that hopefully the debtor is positioned to succeed economically, but still be able to pay you in full, right? That's the goal. Now, there's something about the empty core. The empty core is where you have a whole lot of parties and it's like this endless negotiation. We can't get anywhere. We're just going in circles. This has been identified again. It was a really interesting article, came out of, I think it was Columbia University. And the point they made is that you just got to essentially put, a stick in the ground. You got to make a deal that's going to stick between you and the borrower, and then you try to have everybody else coalesce around that. But until you get kind of that binding agreement, what tends to happen is you get everybody just talking and talking and talking. No real progress is made other than you're just running up the attorney's fees. And again, that only benefits the attorneys. And we're looking here to get the situation resolved. Now, how do we summarize this? How do we deal with all this? So I've got this mnemonic here. What's your HIB? When you're looking at a distressed debt, you want to go through these 3 questions. What hinge am I at, or what hinge am I between? What are the incentives? My incentives, borrower's incentives, third-party incentives. And then what are the biases that are impacting myself, the borrower, other parties, okay? What this does is it's forcing you to ask a question and to think through the situation. Like I said before, the special assets folks that I've worked with, in my opinion, seem to be really good, are the ones that are really thinking through the situation, really understanding the dynamics, because then they make the best decisions, and that tends to get to the best results. Now, I've thrown a lot of stuff at you here today, and it's feeling like being fed with a fire hose. What I've done is I've created a 1-page handout. If you're interested, I can send it to you that capsulates this. I've also created a white paper that essentially summarizes everything I've said here today so you can study it. And then I've actually got coming out in May an academic article in the Drake Journal of Agricultural Law where I go in all the gory detail of the stuff I've cited here. If you're interested in any of that, feel free to contact me. I'll promptly send it to you so you can continue to learn more from it. So that's going to conclude our seminar today. I just want to thank you for attending. You'll see again at the bottom of your screen, there's the continuing legal education icon to report it. The recording of this will be sent to you tomorrow. A brief reminder, we have the survey just here in a couple of moments. If you could take the time, fill it out. Let me know if you want to get the materials. I'll send them to you, and then please give feedback about this webinar here today or other topics you want to learn about, because we try to serve you and help you. So with that, that concludes our presentation for today. Thank you for attending.